It began as an attempt to think about the Gnostic prologue as though I were a Gnostic, thinking in Gnostic thought forms. The next step was to study Logos philosophy theology and the many different meanings and usages of Logos. It became clear that the scribe of John intended Logos to mean the mind of God, especially considering the number of verses in the gospel in which the scribe has Jesus saying that he says only what the Father tells him to say. The verse in John 10, chapter 10, verse 30, amazed me when I read it seriously for the first time. Jesus quoted as saying that he and the Father are one and the same. There are several other verses in which it is said that Jesus and the Father are identical. From a Gnostic perspective, the mind of God was the most important quality about God, and the scribe believed that Jesus was that quality. The scribe must have known the legends of Mount Olympus, including that Athena sprang from the head of Zeus, carrying with her the wisdom of Zeus. It seems logical that the scribe portrays Jesus as springing from the head of God. Now I want to paraphrase what's called the Gnostic prologue of the gospel dedicated to John. That starts out, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now let's translate that and paraphrase that with this new meaning. In the beginning was Jesus as the mind of God, and Jesus as the mind of God was a part of God, and Jesus as the mind of God was God. Jesus as the mind of God was a part of God from the beginning. Everything came into existence by means of Jesus as the mind of God. Nothing that exists came into existence without the involvement of Jesus as the mind of God. Jesus as the mind of God created life, and this life was the light of humankind. The light was shining in the darkness, and the darkness did not defeat Jesus as the mind of God. The real light that provides light for everyone was coming into the world. Although Jesus as the mind of God was in the world and created the world did not recognize Jesus as the mind of God. Jesus as the mind of God came to his own place, but his own people did not receive him as the mind of God. But to all who did receive Jesus as the mind of God, to those who believed in him as the mind of God, he gave the power to be called children of God. They were not born from sexual union, nor from physical desire, nor from male insistence, but from God. Jesus, as the mind of God, became human and made his home among us. We have seen the majesty of Jesus as the mind of God, appropriate as the Father's only Son, complete with grace and truth. The Jewish scribe goes back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 with, "In the beginning." Logos begins with the creation story in Genesis 1, in which God spoke the words and it was done. In Jewish philosophy, Logos is the wisdom of God that is reflected in the reason and moral sense of upright people and in the order and beauty of creation. In Greek philosophy, Logos is the mind of God, reflected or immanent in the intelligibility, rationality, order, and harmony of the universe. Now, Logos theology originates in Hebrew thought and was reinvented in Greek thought by Heraclitus of Ephesus, where the gospel dedicated to John was written. He invented that around 500 BCE, in whose speculations on the unity in the diversity of the cosmos he considered a logos that is ever true, though men are unable to understand it. For though all things come to pass in accordance with this logos, men seem as if they had no experience of them. Now, we'll go back to this statement from Greek mythology that Athena, the goddess of wisdom, Sophia in Greek, sprang from the head of Zeus. And then here are some verses in the gospel dedicated to John that confirm what I'm saying about Jesus as the mind of God. This is in John 3, verses 31 32. He, John the Baptizer, went on to say that Jesus is the one sent from heaven by God who speaks God's language. Next, Jesus said, "My Father never stops laboring, and I don't either." The Jews were offended further because he called God Father and made himself out to be God's equal. That's in chapter 5, verse 17, 18. I promise you, Jesus is quoted as saying, I promise you the Son cannot do anything on his own, but only what he sees the Father doing. The Father and Son do the same things, and bigger things are coming, including raising the dead. That's in chapter 5, verses 19 to 21. In chapter 5, verse 26, we find Father and Son are both the source of life. In chapter 5, verse 30, Jesus' authority is based on what he hears from God and what God wants. Chapter 5, verse 43, he has come identifying with the Father, and they didn't welcome him. Chapter 7, verses 16 and 17, Jesus responded, "What I'm teaching does not originate with me, but with the one who sent me. Anyone who sets out to do what God wants knows well enough whether this teaching originates with God or whether I'm speaking solely on my own authority." In chapter 8, verse 19, Jesus is quoted as saying, "If you recognized me, you would recognize my Father too." In chapter 8, verse 26, "There's a lot I could say about you and condemn you for, but the one who sent me is the real authority, so I'll tell the world what I've heard from him." In chapter 8, verses 28 and 29, he says, "Rather I say what my Father taught me. The one who sent me is with me. He hasn't left me on my own because I always do what pleases him." In chapter 10, verse 30, he says, and this is the mind-blowing verse, "I and the Father are one and the same." In chapter 10, verse 36, "So that you'll fully understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father." Chapter 12, verse 45, "And those who see me see the one who sent me." In chapter 12, verses 49 and 50, he says, "For I don't speak on my own, but the Father who sent me ordered me to say what I said. Therefore, I say just exactly what the Father told me to say." In chapter 14, verses 6 and 7, he says, "No one gets to the Father unless it is through me. If you do know me, you will know my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have even seen him." Chapter 14, verses 9 through 11. "Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. So how can you say, 'Let us see the Father'? Don't you believe that I'm in the Father and the Father is in me? I don't say what I say on my own. The Father is in me constantly, and I perform his labors. You ought to believe that I'm in the Father and the Father is in me." In chapter 14, verse 24, "The things you heard me say are not mine, but come from the Father who sent me." And in chapter 17, verses 7 and 8,
Now they recognize that everything you, the Father, gave me is really from you. The things you gave me to say, I passed on to them, and they have received them and have come to know truly that I came from your presence. It is clear from these verses in the gospel dedicated to John that Jesus is perceived by the scribe of the church of Ephesus, and the congregation of Christians in Ephesus believed that Jesus was the mind of God, presenting the thoughts of God through Jesus' mouth, through Jesus' teachings. And that makes this Gospel of John make better sense if we understand that Jesus is presented as the mind of God.